Welcome to the OnlyFans Secrets Marketing Podcast. The goal of this podcast is to help both new and established OnlyFans creators learn the basics of online branding, marketing, and promotion to help you make more money with your content and maximize your time online. My name is Richard Lewis, and I have over 20 years of internet marketing experience. So let's get started with today's topic. And that topic is OnlyFans secure the bag icons, Empress Theodora. All right, so to end Women's History Month, we are going to go way back in time and look at the Roman Empress Theodora, a woman who rose from nothing to become one of the most powerful women in the world of her time. I'm going to discuss her story and what we can learn from it today. So who is Empress Theodora and why should you care about her? All right, so she was an actress, empress, and a early women's rights advocate. She was born in 500 AD to an actress and a bear trainer. And she became an escort/prostitute at a young age, as well as being an actress. So we need to have some background on the Eastern Roman Empire and chariot races to understand her time. So at this time, chariot races were the sport in Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. So there was something called a hippodrome, and that is basically a giant stadium. And those stadiums would hold, or at least that one in Constantinople held 100,000 people in a city that might have only had 500,000 to 700,000 people total. So you can imagine that's a lot of people. I mean, even today, some of the biggest stadiums in the world only hold 100,000. So this is a huge amount. So chariot races became super popular once the Eastern Roman Empire overall became more religious and they outlawed gladiatorial sports. So in this world that she was born into, there were two factions, the blue and green factions. They were the equivalent of teams. It would be like if the only teams that existed in the world were, say, the Patriots and the Chiefs. So there would be someone who was a fan of, one team as opposed to another. And these particular factions, they acted not just as sports organizations, but as clubs, political parties, and sometimes criminal organizations as well. So basically, if you were in one of those two groups, you looked out for people who were also in that group. So Theodora's father died at 4 years old, and he was a bear trainer for the green group. And her mother decided to go ahead and support the blue group. So she had two other sisters. And as I mentioned, her mother was an actress. And at that time, actress didn't just mean actress. You were an actress, you did do stage performances, but it also meant that you were doing SW type work. So you were basically doing escorting and prostitution and doing a whole bunch of other things. So her upbringing consisted of that at a very young age. So sadly, this is the world that she was born into. Where her mother was an actress and now she was going to be an actress as well. And what she was known for was a play called Lyda and the Swan. Now, this is a very interesting play because, again, we're talking about a time where people were now, in monotheistic religion, but they were still hearkening back to, the old Greek style of, mythicism, or mythology. So you have this play called Lyda and the Swan, which is about Zeus basically impregnating a normal woman with Helen of Troy. And how Zeus did this is that he made himself appear to be a swan. So Theodora's performances were basically where she would be out on a stage and with a swan, and food that a swan would eat would be thrown on her, and you can imagine what would happen from there. Again, this is still a general audience podcast, but you can imagine that would be a very odd thing to be seeing. But apparently, Theodora was very animated and very comical about what she was doing. And so she gained a reputation sort of fame, a little bit of fame from being really good at that particular play. It's very interesting because, as I mentioned, the empire at this point was monotheistic. It was a Christian empire, but they were still having these sort of performances, and no one had really gone about looking after young women, and they continued to have these kind of things going on. And what happened was that she met Justinian later, as she was, a fan of, again, the blue faction, this whole thing with the chariot races coming into play again. So it's where someone of high ranking could meet someone of lower social status. You would wonder how an emperor or someone who eventually would become an emperor would meet someone like that. Well, everyone just hung together if they were also a fan of that particular chariot team. So we also need to know who Justinian is. So Justinian is an interesting character. Justinian is now known as one of the best, if not the best, of the Eastern Roman emperors. Justinian is still known to this day for many things, including the fact that he wrote down a lot of the Roman laws. He also tried to reunify the Roman Empire. So he's a very famous emperor. And oddly, he also started from humble beginnings as a peasant farmer. And he ends up becoming one of the greatest Roman emperors, but he was not born into wealth. It actually is that his uncle, Justin, who also was a swineherd or farmer, became head of the imperial guard. And what happened was that his emperor at that time died. And since he was the person inside of Constantinople who had control over troops and no one else had troops, he had a lot of sway, and he was able to push people in his direction. And even though he started out as a swineherder, he became emperor at the age of 70. So when he 70 at that time, pretty darn old. Still to this day, it's a decent age, but he did not last long as emperor. And Justinian then became emperor as his basically favorite nephew. So again, he came from lower means. And he ended up having to have a special law to marry Theodora because at the time, people of high rank could not marry actresses. Now, again, the word actress to you and I does not mean what it did to people at that time, because again, people were, kind of doing both things when they were an actress. So he had to wait until his uncle died to actually marry Theodora, because his great aunt did not believe that anyone should be marrying actresses. So he was able to change that law, and then he was able to marry Theodora. So what is Theodora's impact? Okay, so one of the things that Theodora is most known for was there was an incident in which a good portion of Constantinople was destroyed. There was a riot in the Hippodrome among the two factions. I imagine that was going to happen eventually. And people were basically trying to overthrow the entire government from that riot. And Justinian was going to go ahead and flee because things were so terrible. But just Theodora was able to basically rally everyone around with a speech. And the end of her speech was, "Royal purple is the noblest shroud." So purple at the time was a very, a hard color to recreate as far as materials. So it was very expensive. So basically royal people were the only people who could afford to wear purple. So she was saying that she would rather die, an empress than to live outside in shame, I guess, by fleeing. And she rallied Justinian, and Justinian ended up deciding to stay in the city. And he sent his top general into the Hippodrome, where it's estimated that 30,000 rioters were killed. But Justinian was able to stay in power, and so was Theodora. So for the rest of his reign, many people feel that he listened to her a lot because she saved his job, basically, and his empire. So she also expanded women's rights in a lot of ways after that. So she was able to get through legislation with him, or I would say legislation, but it was likely just fiat. So he would say, this is what's going to go on. But he was able to, push through with her expanded women's rights in divorce and property ownership. Also, he put forth a death penalty for rape. And he forbade the killing of a wife for committing adultery. So a lot of that, would seem today, other than obviously the death penalty for rape, to be pretty common sense laws. But, at the time, women didn't have very many rights. So he helped push with her for that, and she was definitely instrumental, and she was very instrumental in outlawing prostitution. So she went through and she made it a crime, arrested pimps, made it a criminal offense to run any sort of prostitution within the empire. And it is even said that she rounded up 500 some odd prostitutes and put them into a convent, which is kind of controversial because people don't necessarily want to be in a convent, but basically just to get them to no longer be able to do that kind of thing. So it's interesting. That's a very draconian way of solving that particular issue. There must have not been other ways around it, but it seemed like there was no way for her to make it kind of safe for people. And she also had these horrible experiences when she was younger. So it definitely made sense on why she wanted to do that. Now, what we can learn from her, we certainly can learn a lot. First of all, her circumstances show that there's no shame in wherever you come from and whatever work you're doing. So she ended up actually being someone who would have people bow down in front of her, and sometimes they couldn't even look up directly. They were just allowed to come in, sort of plank themselves onto the floor, and hold up their hand, and that's about it. So she went from someone who was definitely mistreated and to someone who demanded a lot of respect. So certainly when people look down upon, say, OnlyFans creators for what you're doing, right now in your life,